righty. So with that, I think I see the participant number going up and we're happy about that, but I think I will go and get it ahead and get started so that we can get to the meat of the program. So I just want to say hello and thank you all for joining this important discussion. I am Casey Anglada Durad, and I lead NewSpace New Mexico, the host for this webinar. NewSpace New Mexico is a nonprofit established to grow the space industry from New Mexico, but for the nation. Our mission is to accelerate the pace of innovation by providing our members with direct and faster access to the right connections, resources, and customers. We are here to unite and ignite the space ecosystem for the nation. I want to give you a little background of where this webinar and the report and so on came from. Back in May last year, NewSpace New Mexico hosted the State of the Space Industrial Base 2020 with key participants from the U.S. Space Force, Defense Innovation Unit, and Air Force Research Lab. We had excellent participation across industry, government, and academia. With that, we had six working groups, and by far the most engaged, I mean, they all were very engaging, but one of the most engaged is the Space Policies and Finance Working Group, of which Mir Sadat, our authors of this report, Mir Sadat and Bruce Cahan, and many others were leading that. There was a resulting report from the State of the Space Industrial Base 2020 workshop that came out in July, and a lot of the recommendations came from that Space Policies and Finance group. So Bruce Cahan and Mir Sadat, who you'll hear from in a second, continue to drill down into those important recommendations. And from that, the recently released Space Policies for the New Space Age, competing on the final Economic Frontier report just came out, and that's where you could find a lot of the information on it on newspacenm.org. So NewSpace New Mexico has partnered with Bruce and Mir to release this report, but also host these 5 webinars to kind of unpack the important points. So today you're joining us for the great game of economics afoot in space, and I hope you'll be happy. Today, you'll hear from our distinguished authors. We'll have a keynote presentation from Kevin O'Connell from the Office of Space Commerce at the U.S. Department of Commerce, and then we have a dynamic cross-industry panel. So for right now, I'd like to introduce our 2 distinguished authors, Bruce Cahan and Dr. Mir Sadat. So Bruce Cahan is a lecturer and distinguished scholar at Stanford University, where he co-founded the Sustainable Banking Initiative. As an Ashoka Fellow and a CEO of Urban Logic, a New York nonprofit, Bruce researches and leads efforts to create the Space Commodities Exchange as essential financial engineering for the new space economy. Bruce is a licensed lawyer in California, New York, and Pennsylvania, and has practiced as a Wall Street lawyer in New York City with the international law firm of Weil, Gotshal, and Manges. Dr. Mir Sadat recently departed the U.S. National Security Council at the White House, where he led the Interagency on Defense and Space Policy issues, preparing the President, National Security Advisor, and White House senior officials on significant civil, commercial, and national security topics. Mir is also a naval officer with intelligence and space qualifications, and prior to his government service has spent many years in various capacities with industry. I want to turn the webinar over now to Bruce Cahan and Mir Sadat, and just want to say we at NewSpace New Mexico have been very honored to work with these wonderful authors. So Mir and Bruce, would you like to take it over? I think the rest of us will start our video and let you take it on. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Hey, Casey, thanks so much. And thank you, NewSpace New Mexico. There's no space between new and space in their name. That's something important that we learned along the way. But thank you so much for everything you've done in the past year for space that commercial, civil, and national security depended on. And like you mentioned, the Space Industrial Base 2020 report and the numerous days of brainstorming, finding solutions, and then finding a way to capture all those great thoughts were amazing. And so really quickly, the workshop that Pavnet Singh, myself, and Catherine Koleski chaired was looking at space policy and finance. And so we had some brilliant minds there, and we captured some of those participants' names in the report at the end, so you could see that. And so what we didn't want to do is print out another 5 to 10 page Washington, D.C. inner circle report on a finding that is just going to go and sit on a shelf until a great American and humanitarian like Kevin O'Connell finds his way to that shelf and then sort of operationalizes that decades from today. So we wanted to make sure we tell the whole story, a truthful story, a compelling story, and one that we actually find some solutions for. So if you think about strategy being how to do it, policy being what to do, grand strategy, what we stand for, and national interest, what we strive for, our report sort of had those 4 pillars as we wrote each section or chapter, as you might consider, and as we wrote our recommendations. And so as we wrote the report, various types of previous analogies came to mind. A lot of them, of course, sci-fi, but we drew on our own experiences. Myself being a recovering academic from California and DC, started asking, hey, this is sort of similar to the Great Game of the 18th century in South Asia between Tsarist Russia and colonial Britain, right? And the Great Game was over a territory of Afghanistan, Pakistan region, and the region was considered important because of strategic location and, of course, access to resources in what is now Central Asia, to the Middle East, and then back to the Indian subcontinent where the British were there for centuries, right? So we sort of said, can we use the same type of paradigm? Of course, nothing fits 100% to describe what is going on in space, the competition, whether it's healthy or not, economic, political, strategic, for resources and positioning in space. And so the title for the first webinar derives its name from that particular piece. As we wrote our report, and it was a 6-month process between a lawyer and an academic, so you can imagine how much back and forth there was, healthy back and forth. And Bruce and I have never met, so this was a great testament to remote learning and discipline. But we shared it with private sector partners, government, and then, of course, our colleagues in the science and technology community as well. And we incorporated some of their feedbacks. And as we were looking for someone to write our foreword, we wanted to make sure that we utilized our capabilities fullest, right? And so we highlight there our national instruments of power, our traditional ones, the new ones, and also the sort of emergent ones, right? So you've heard of DIME, diplomacy, information, military, economics, and then PHIL, which is financial, intelligence, legal, and then the emergent ones, which are science and technology. And as we thought, who would be a great person to come and write this? Would it be a military person? Would it be someone from the civil sector, from the scientific sector? We could have think of no one except a guy named Kevin O'Connell. A person with impeccable class and tolerance of diverse thoughts, and someone who actually uses those to advance the cause of our nation, of our allies, and those of commerce. And so Kevin, fits every single category in that: the national, the diplomacy, the intelligence, having worked in the Pentagon, sort of the defense and military aspects, economics, where he's at right now, and this S&T piece, he is a private industry CEO, as well as someone in the government. And so we thought that this person would be, if he or she chooses to write our forward, would be the best person. Now, disclaimer, we did not write his forward. It was all Kevin O'Connell's work. And then he asked us what we thought, and we said, wow, this was much punchier and better than Bruce and I would have written. So we are very thankful to him. So without further ado, and going through his bio, which all of you already know, I'd like to turn this over to Bruce and have Bruce give you his perspective on the report, as well as things that were not in the report that he considers are important. Thank you so much, Bruce. Thank you so much, Kevin.
Mir, you said it amazingly. Kevin is a superstar. He's been a shining light for all of my time pursuing the activities that I have in DC. So thank you everybody for coming. This is a big day for us. I wanted to touch on a couple of the motivations that I had, and as you hear, having a Navy guy like Mir and a lawyer, recovering lawyer like me in the room is an interesting 6 months of activity. We complete each other's sentences now. My motivation for this was pretty simple. Alongside the major technology and scientific conversations that we have at places like NewSpace, New Mexico, and AIA, I didn't hear enough about financial engineering, about how we're going to have new investment and risk transfer mechanisms that could guarantee funding to the new space economy and the old space economy, especially in the constrained budget environment after COVID. And VCs, and I teach at Stanford, can't fund everything during the duration of what we're going to be building. Second motivation was that there is this economic competition, as Mir points out, with US adversaries and even some allies. And I don't hear enough about using the full range of financial and market stabilizing mechanisms that really uniquely built the US terrestrial economy to its strength and its diversity. And so, you know, our reports stem from those and other insights as critical infrastructure. We spoke in nonpartisan, multi-administration ways. We look at a 2060 vision, and this is Mir's term, finding a North Star vision for the country, so that can be what we are building the critical infrastructure of space to be. And you know, Mir has been an amazing co-author. Some of the most important recommendations we can get to after our panel. But I do want to, we just wanted to introduce ourselves and really welcome everybody, and especially thank NewSpace New Mexico and Kevin for supporting this effort. So please take it away, Kevin.
All right. Hi, everybody. Mir, Bruce, thanks very much. Set a pretty high bar, obviously. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kevin O'Connell. I'm the Director of the Office of Space Commerce at the U.S. Department of Commerce. Let me start by thanking NewSpace New Mexico for inviting me back. I was in the first series of discussions. Also, let me congratulate Mir and Bruce for really an excellent report in an area that it wouldn't surprise you someone from the Commerce Department would welcome, because we often see technical, scientific aspects that are absolutely necessary in the focus. We are not seeing enough yet about economic incentives and finance and things like that, even as those are changing. And so, number one, congratulations on a fine report. I was honored to draft the forward for the report. You take a look at that; it's relatively short. And lastly, of course, I'm also honored to be part of the panel with many old friends and colleagues that have been along for the ride here while I have been at Commerce. So let me just offer a few introductory remarks as we get going and get us to the panel as quickly as we can. In the forward, I wrote about the notion of comparative advantage in the the great race that is afoot in space. And again, welcome the focus on economics here as well. Comparative advantage has many different dimensions that we can talk about. It has entrepreneurship, it has partnership, it has other things, and I'll hit on some of those very, very quickly. But you know, it's really one of the things we want to focus on as an outcome of that. But I also suggest in my notes that these are things that can leverage both government and industry capabilities. And so I want to focus for a bit on both of those. You know, on the government side, it's stock taking time, it's transition time. And so on the government side, we have just been through an unprecedented level of development of space policy over the past 4 years and space activities that go along with them. And obviously, one of the key points of emphasis in space policy has been harnessing the innovation of the private sector. You know, what we are seeing in terms of commercialization, and again, everyone that is on this seminar knows, you know, commercial is roughly 80% of the global space economy. And so it really prompts us to think differently than we did in the past about space, how it's pursued, the role of different actors. You know, I have given talks around the world on making sure we expand our understanding of the impact of the growing role of the private sector in space as part of my responsibilities here at Commerce. So we've been through an unprecedented level of development in American history of space policy, really pushing for how to harness the private sector. And the importance of that was really coupled in the national space policy, which was really covered, I should say, in the national space policy recently released, you know, back in October. Very much the culmination of lots of other activities, space policy directives, et cetera. But I would point to a couple of key things in the national space policy, the new national space policy. First of all is the prominent role of commercial space activities. Now, every single space policy in our collective memory has included mention of commercial activities, but this one really spoke to the critical nature of commercial activities to our national security and to our economic prosperity. That's very much key in this particular. And I'll say that in the interagency discussions that went on, it would not surprise you that the Commerce Department argued for a loud representation of commercial activities in that space policy, but I would offer that so did equally the Department of Defense and other players. And so, you know, it was a uniform view that the commercial industry is really absolutely vital to what we're talking about. To say it another way, I think for the first time, we've always known space as being a venue for critical national security capabilities, but I think we're finally recognizing the economic value of space. You know, Carissa's on with us today. You know, I think Carissa has written about this as being an industry which for the United States alone has $5 trillion of economic impact annually. And that's a substantial industry. It doesn't matter, you know, it's very substantial. And so how do we sustain that? How do we think about that in the course of this particular competition? It was very much covered in most of the space policy directives. I'll mention just briefly one of the things, and the group had a little chat before we came on. You may have seen recently the reporting out of our sister agency, the Bureau of Economic Analysis here at Commerce, and many of the folks that are on the panel today were instrumental in participating and thinking about understanding the space economy better. You know, we've had a very healthy debate in this country about what to count and how to count it. And I turned to my colleagues in the Bureau of Economic Analysis and said, can you help us do this? They turned to industry, they turned to international partners, the OECD, others, and actually have now just published the first experimental statistics on the space economy. I think that's very important because from a Commerce Department perspective, those are now collected and captured in the same way we capture other national economic statistics. And I think improving the rigor of all of that kind of information is kind of the first step to understanding how we compete better, how we compete more effectively. It's also attracted, by the way, the efforts of BEA have also attracted considerable international attention, not just of our space agency colleagues, but also economic and finance and statistical ministries abroad. And so we think this can be the leadership of a global effort to improve our understanding of the space economy and the different trends that are going on within it. in parallel to what's going on in industry. Also some exceptional research. Another part that I would emphasize in the government's role is how to leverage the rest of the government. Again, it doesn't surprise us when we talk about NASA or DoD's interest in space, but we have made a concerted effort in the recent past to bring in the rest of the U.S. government, in essence, the economic development investment agencies as well, organizations like the Exim Bank that you've probably heard of, but not everybody would pass a full quiz on what the Exim Bank is and what it does and things like that. You've seen recently there's over $2 billion in space-related requests into the Exim Bank. DFC, Development Finance Corporation, TDA. So we've made a concerted effort to pull those tools out of the toolkit in support of the U.S. commercial space industry. And that's very, very important. Again, Bruce, Mir have written extensively about the nature of using the entire toolkit. And this is important today, and it'll be important into the future. You know, how we're going to use those capabilities. The government's been a better customer. I've talked about this, you've heard me speak before, you know, in the time that I've been in this job. The government is improving its role as a customer. It's better at providing seed capital, if you will, in the market. It's better at exploring things in the market. You know, we look to things like the Air Force pitch days and some of the other activities that are like that. And what's happening in the market now, in a way that didn't happen a decade ago, is that a company can come in, get a small initial project from the government that the government is genuinely interested in, by the way, and then turn into the capital markets and say, okay, the government is interested in this, and get an independent reading on the extent to which those capabilities are potentially commercializable, if I can use that word, actually. And so that dynamic has actually really changed the equation as we've seen this. Commercial capabilities really coming into the market. What's interesting about those is that they have done it with much greater efficiency, applying business practices, commercial efficiencies to traditional space models, and brought attendant cost savings and speed of innovation into the market. And that's really, really important. And it's why we're seeing the fast movement of activities in the market. I had a conversation with the Secretary a few weeks ago. You may have seen his op-ed in Space News called Space Commerce Accelerating. You know, things we were just talking about 2 years ago are actually either coming into the market for in an operational way, or certainly in a research and testing kind of a way. Very exciting to see that speed pick up. A couple other things on the government side. You know, government is a better partner, a more predictable partner, and I think we've done better in that. And I think, you know, more work can be done, but I think we've done better in that. Regulatory reform. You know, we've had 4 years of a focus on regulatory reform, the NOAA remote sensing rule, the FAA launch rule, but regulatory reform is a continuing activity. It's not only designed to encourage commercial activities, it's designed to get people that oversee those in the government to think about things faster, to make decisions about harder and harder cases that are coming in the market. So that's a place where more work is going to be required. Let me swing for just a couple of minutes over to the private sector. You know, you've heard me say before, one of the most exciting things that I've had in this role here is we see so many different entrepreneurs come across our doorstep from companies big and small. I actually don't like the labels that go with NewSpace and Old Space and things like that, because we see diversity and innovation coming out of the entire space industry, if you will. And so I think the other point I'd make about the commerce vantage point on this is that many things that are seen in defense at organizations like DIU, we see many of those here as well at Commerce. But we also see things that would not normally go to defense, you know, other space activities that people would not think about taking naturally to the Department of Defense or NASA. So we probably see one of the largest cuts of activity out of the industry. And that's very, very exciting, as it turns out. We're also seeing, it's a great point of emphasis in the report, we're seeing new innovations in the financial sector. Very, very exciting. Again, private sector finance, private sector insurance has been absolutely key to moving this ball as quickly as it has. We held a seminar, I think, Bruce, this is where I first met you. We held a seminar at the end of 2018 looking at ways to stretch out the finance portfolio for new space missions that we see coming into the market. And we're starting to see activities like that. We're hearing about not just the traditional venture capital, but we're hearing about venture that's extending for longer term horizons, the special purpose acquisition corporations, a whole host of other things. There are even other things that could be applied, tax credits, there's a whole range of, Bruce, I think you used the phrase financial engineering in the market. Those developments are going to have to continue to take place at the same speed, and it's a very quick speed of developments in the space sector. And so it's another reason why I welcome what you've got in the report. Let's see. Trying to see what some other things that we've heard about. Of course, one of the things we're trying to do is to increase investor confidence in investing in the space environment. I will not talk about it in this, uniquely not talk about it in this particular webinar, but the whole issue of space debris, not just is thought about from a space safety perspective, but as an economic aspect of how we think about global space markets. And so we can talk more about that in questions if you'd like. Role of partnerships here, absolutely key. We have many traditional space allies that are absolutely exceptional allies. The Europeans, the Japanese, others, Commonwealth countries that we've enjoyed great, intense conversations with. But I think the nature of partnerships now has to change to include the emerging space powers. And I think there's a way to do that, not only leveraging US government capabilities, but also traditional space allies and the private sector as we look at countries that are trying to get into the space economy. And again, as we look, and I've spent a lot of time talking with folks, other countries are interested as much for economic growth, workforce development, traditional economic reasons, as they are the exploration missions, which excite all of us as we go further and further to the heavens. So those initiatives are very important as well. Let me just close by saying this. 2021, we already know, is going to be an exciting year. We have at least 3 Mars landings planned. We'll probably see space tourism by the end of the year. Very, very exciting. It's just the beginning of the race that we're talking about here. And so we have to employ all of these levers that we have at disposal, government and industry, in order to get there. And on that note, I'll stop and I'll look forward to the questions when we get into the panel discussion. So thanks very much, everybody.
Oh my gosh, thank you, Kevin, and thank you for bringing up such thought-provoking points. It was great to hear from you back last year at the State of the Space Industrial Base 2020, and again now. We want to thank you from NewSpace New Mexico on all your support of this effort and hope to continue working with you. I am now going to introduce our very distinguished panel. I want to say that if you all have questions, if you just put your questions into the Q&A tab, and that can include questions to our authors, to Kevin O'Connell, also to the panel members. And after the panel presentations, we'll take some time to field those questions. I'm going to introduce very quickly this distinguished panel. If I went through a full introduction of them, it would take over 20 minutes because they are just amazing when you read the bios. The bios, the program was sent out to you all, and it's also available at newspacenm.org, as well as I do want to remind folks we are recording, and that recording will also be available on that website later. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce this distinguished panel and start off with Dr. Keith W. Crane, who is an economist with Science and Technology Policy Institute, working on issues pertaining to space, civilian nuclear power, quantum technologies. Next will be Mike French, who is the president for Space Systems at the Aerospace Industries Association, working to advocate for policies, regulations, and investments that ensure American leadership and strong industry partnership. Next is Chris Johnson, who is a space law advisor for the Secure World Foundation and an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. Then we will go to Dr. Brendan Mulvaney, who is the director of the China Aerospace Studies Institute, or CASI. Christian Jor serves as executive staff to the Procurement and Space Industry Council at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, leading policy formation, advocacy on defense acquisition and civilian space programs. And finally, Carissa Bryce Christensen is the CEO and founder of Bryce Space and Technology. I'm very honored to be on this platform with these wonderful speakers. And I will turn it over to Keith to start off, and we'll hear from all 6 of them. And thank you very much for participating.
Good to unmute here. Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity. Echoing Kevin, I do want to underline the impressive development we've seen of new innovative space technologies and services over the last now almost 2 decades with the founding of SpaceX. And the US government has been very helpful to the growth of this industry. There's new contracting mechanisms. Of course, it's not only been helpful for achievement of US government missions of human space exploration, space science, but also fostering US economic growth. That said, I'd like to turn now to what is the space economy. And my overall message is kind of we need to have a really firm understanding of the size and growth of that economy so as not to overpromise and underperform. So as the Bureau of Economic Analysis and others have looked at it, the space economy, really I look at 3 different sections of it. One is the goods and services that are provided to governments and households and businesses from space. And we look at that in terms of the US government about its goal of human space exploration and for us consumers, things like telecommunication, broadcast TV. We also look at the purchases on Earth, like TV satellite dishes and GPS, and then of course, production of rockets, satellites, and equipment for space. But when we look at the aggregate, it's important to note the difference between final demand, which is those goods and services that are sold to consumers, final consumers, and not double count the production of rockets and satellites. You can't add both sales of those pieces of equipment and also the expenditures that are made on those. I'd also like to underline that for the entrepreneur, and when we look at investment in this industries, they are cognizant of the enormous benefits that GPS has provided for the economy as a whole, but they are unable to capture those benefits themselves. So when we look at prospects for investors and entrepreneurs, we have to really look at what our revenues are likely to look at. In this context, the Bureau of Economic Analysis has come up with their figures, and their total contribution of GDP is about $109 billion in 2018, or about 0.5% of GDP. We have to be careful to note that this is kind of the money, the market that these entrepreneurs are facing. And in addition to that, growth in the aggregate space economy has been half the rate of growth in GDP between 2012 and 2018. So the bottom line is currently this sector is a pretty small part of our economy, and it hasn't been growing rapidly. The question is why? Why has growth been slow? Well, 2 of the major components of demand have been telecom, including direct broadcast TV, which have fallen on hard times, and government space programs, which have been growing, but growing fairly slowly. The flip side is that the new emerging sectors like remote internet and space tourism that are coming for the future, they're starting now, but they're a very small part of this economy at this point in time, and we're not quite sure what that growth will ultimately be. So what are the policy implications of this? There's very strong bipartisan growth for human space exploration, space science since the 1960s. And the continued support for these initiatives and for supporting the space economy depend in part, or a great part, about the performance and our successes there. So we need to be cognizant, and I think policymakers, investors, and entrepreneurs, they really need to have a clear-eyed view of what the size and the prospective growth of the space economy is, so as not to overpromise, underdeliver. The last thing we want to do is see a boom-bust cycle in this sector, and we want to make sure that investors and entrepreneurs can tailor their efforts to be successful and not be focused on markets that may not materialize. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith. I'll take it from here. This is Mike French. I'm the Vice President for Space Systems at the Aerospace Industries Association. What we do is we represent about over 300 companies across the aerospace and defense supply chain, both companies big, medium, and small. And my role there is to lead the space policy efforts for the association. Thank you for letting me participate today, and thank you, NewSpace New Mexico, for including us in this discussion. We'll start out with a few big picture points that struck me as I read the report to get the discussion going. The first one will be, I'll call it the dog or the tail, right? That's sort of the first one, and the second one, regulations. So the dog and tail. What's so interesting when we look at space policy questions and issues is we sometimes have to decide what's the dog and what's the tail when it comes to space, right? You know, sometimes space is the market or space is the policy area. Sometimes space is an enabling capability, right? For example, if my job, if I'm selling the service of getting on this webinar, right? Space may be a way I do that, but it may not be the only way, right? I may be thinking about terrestrial choices, et cetera. And so this comes up a lot when we think about these policy questions, and I think the report does a good job of thinking through those. Just a few examples, you know, that I've encountered in the last year. When we faced COVID, a couple different times it came up there where when we were looking at what is the COVID impacts on the supply chain, it became clear, you know, somewhat early on that when we looked at the aerospace supply chain, a lot of the folks with national security work, they had disruptions because, you know, employees getting sick or hard to get to work and that sort of thing, but there was still a demand coming from the government and the ability to work. However, there was a huge drop in demand for those people who service the commercial aviation business. And you had a huge segment of the supply chain that worked on both aerospace issues with national security focus or commercial focus, but also aviation issues. And suddenly you had suppliers, especially small suppliers, where they might have seen a huge percentage of their revenue all of a sudden drop, which incredibly changed their business model and would then have this outsized impact on the aerospace industry that we may have been somewhat blind to before. Another area where we saw this, you know, sort of tail dog question was with critical infrastructure. And I know the report talks about this a lot. You know, early on in trying to figure out how what applied to essentiality and essential employees, it's very clear in the DHS CISA structure that the defense industrial base applies, communication system applies, transportation system applies. Space falls in between there, right? It's critical to those areas, but in itself, it's not always called out, right? It's clear if you're working on national security space, but less clear if you're doing a commercial space project or a civil space project. And this was saying, you know, I give a lot of credit to DHS CISA here in the course of COVID, especially in the early days, had a lot of open lines of communication with US industry to say, look, we need to be very clear in these areas where they fall between the critical infrastructure specific definitions to make sure that those people have the clarity and direction they need. And it's something that CISA continue to work on. I think is doing some good work in thinking about how does space fit in both as its own sector, but also as an enabler of all these other critical sectors. You know, sort of a final example I'll give here is workforce, right? So space companies, you know, we face a question of both, you know, sort of STEM workforce as well as highly trained manufacturing workforce. But that's a question that's faced by sort of US industry as a whole across sectors. And so when we think about that as AIA, it's something that we don't tackle as a space problem necessarily, but something we need to tackle as a whole of government approach. And I think sort of overall, sort of this topic, I think, speaks to a lot of things in the report about the importance of the whole in government approach, and ties into a lot of things Kevin was talking about, the benefits that he's done as an Office of Space Commerce, looking beyond just any one sector of space, but also looking beyond space as just its own marketplace. Then a second big picture on regulations. It's an interesting dynamic when we have regulatory constraints on what we can sell as U.S. industry, right? Because often these are driven by national security concerns. And there's two categories that we often run into, right? So category one is there's some limit because we thought a technology shouldn't leave the US borders, right? But what's happened over time is there's now non-US actors that have that same technology and they're selling it widely, right? So now US industry is unable to compete because of an existing regulation that other non-US industry is actively selling, right? That's case one. Case two is something where US industry is selling something that truly is unique and only available in the United States. And there's a national security concern if it were to be sold elsewhere, right? US policymakers, when they think about these export controls, need to think about these two cases, right? Because even in the second case, where it's only a US capability, the ability to sell that is what enables a lot of the research and development that allows the capability to get enhanced, right, and get taken to the next level. And so I give a lot of credit in this kind of policy debate to Kevin O'Connell, to the Department of Commerce and NOAA, when they recently thought about their commercial space remote sensing regulations. They took this framework directly into their thinking and are now applying it, and we'll have some really interesting case studies here over the next quarter, 2 quarters, as companies start working on this framework. So 2 big picture thoughts on the report, and looking forward to the discussion.
All right, well, thank you, and I'll take it from there for the next 5 minutes. So as the Secure World Foundation, Secure World is an NGO focused on peaceful and sustainable uses of outer space. I want to thank our hosts and our organizers for inviting me to weigh in and participate on this panel. I'm no expert in economics whatsoever, but I can give some type of context, international context, and perhaps implications of what's proposed and what's discussed in the report, more of an international relations and international law perspective. So right off the top, one thing I was impressed by the report was that it takes this 40-year perspective. It looks at, a vision for 2060. And this is exactly the type of long-range thinking that is beneficial and conducive to fostering the future that you want, not looking at merely short-term interests and short-term exigencies, but long-term interests and, in fact, long-term values will allow you to plan in the present for a long-term future. 40 years is both not too far in the future and also not right around the corner. 40 years ago was 1980. In 1980, what were they thinking about in terms of commerce in space and commercialization of space? Could they imagine what space commerce looks like in 2020? No, they couldn't, but they probably got some things correct. It's not necessary to get everything correct in your vision of the future, so long as you get a few things correct and you iterate as you go on a regular time scale. So, maybe we can do even a better job than they did, in the planning for the future 40 years than folks have in the past. So I'm impressed by that, taking that long-term approach into account. However, as I read the report, I did notice that, I did think, is this looking at space merely from a commerce from a security lens? And there is this kind of overlap between thinking of commerce as a race or geopolitical rivalry with security implications. And I did have some type of quandary or hesitation about, assigning too much mere security issues or seeing space commerce through this purely security lens. When I hear rhetoric about how America should dominate space, this rubs me the wrong way, and it will rub our international partners the wrong way. It's fine to say that you want to dominate space commerce or space commercialization or space exploitation, space exploration. You want to be the primary actor, the person setting, the actor setting precedents. But saying that you want to dominate an area that's outside of your state jurisdiction, this is certainly, I think, a little bit the wrong way to go. And it's going to make it more difficult for you to do international partnerships if actors say, well, should we sign these Artemis Accords? These folks want to dominate outer space. So I put that in there just to be a little bit, to give you caution, because there is, the international perspective to think about. However, how we will get other partners and actors to think about and engage with us on this is not through, dictating to the rest of the world what the rules should be. Dictating to the rest of the world what the rules should be in space commerce by saying that this is what we want or this is the best way forward. It is more, in fact, persuasion and selling that you have richer rewards through a modicum of correctly balanced rules than no rules whatsoever. And the example that I give shortly, is that there is a modicum of rules for, say, in traffic, for how interstate, traffic and how rules of the road work. So therefore, you have richer rewards because everyone knows that there's some rules of the road, the way that we should go, and in fact your freedom and your security is enriched by a modicum of those rules. So as we engage with international partners, we say that it is in your own best national interest to have rules of the road. Some of those rules should be binding, and that you will benefit from having correctly balanced rules and a modicum of those rules. So with that, I look forward to the discussion.
All right, great. Well, thanks. Thanks to everyone, and thanks to the other panelists for kind of setting this up. I definitely appreciate the lead-ins. So I'm Brendan Mulvaney. I'm from the China Aerospace Studies Institute. We are a U.S. Air Force organization. I have offices here at National Defense University and down at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. So we're kind of dual-hatted here. Everything I say is my own personal opinion. It doesn't represent CASI or the U.S. government. But I am here to talk about the people with whom we're competing, right? And so the idea that there's a great game afoot and there's competition. We're not just competing with ourselves, we're competing with principally China at this point, that I'll focus on, but also, the Europeans and the Russians to a minor extent. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind throughout all this is that, one, the Chinese, despite what you probably read in the press, are not 10 feet tall. They're not coming to take over the world, but they have made a lot of improvements over the last specifically 2 decades. They have a plan. They are executing that plan, and they are trying to take what they see as their rightful place in the world order after some period of time that they didn't hold that. And so they're marching toward that. And space is absolutely on that priority list for Xi Jinping, for the Communist Party, and for the People's Republic of China. So make no doubt about it. This is high on the list for him. They've put a lot of money, a lot of effort, and starting to see some actual policies into that. The one thing that China has that the United States and Western democracies don't have is typically the ability to plan and program over the long term. Why is that? Because they don't have elections. So when Jiang Zemin took power, when Hu Jintao took power, and when Xi Jinping took power, they each knew they had 10 years, perhaps longer now in the case of Xi Jinping. But at the time, they knew they had 10 years, a fairly willing and compliant bureaucracy, and the ability to use all levers of state power and party power. And so that allows them to establish long-term goals, establish big programs, to work at them incrementally, but to keep up the funding and the policy goals that are required over that span of time. And by and large, they get to pick their successors. So they have a pretty good idea that at least their important programs are going to continue somewhat into the next administration. This obviously is not necessarily true of any of the Western democracies. I'm not saying it's a better system. I'm just saying it's different, and we have to realize that that's who we're competing against. The other thing that they have, which has become more clear and more prevalent under Xi Jinping, is they have a far more integrated system of national, I don't want to say national unity, but national effort. And this is because in the People's Republic of China, the Communist Party of China is able to influence, either directly or indirectly, the commercial sector in ways that specifically the United States, but our Western allies and democracies just can't do. So they have party committees within each of the so-called private or commercial companies. The leadership of all the state-owned enterprises and the entities that the state-owned enterprises own through proxies, through stock, through investments, are all controlled by the Communist Party's organization department. So they are the ones picking who sits on the boards, who are the presidents and things like that. They control the levers of power for finance. All of the state banks or all the major banks in China are state-owned. And even a lot of the private and the venture capital gets flown through the party apparatus. This combined with a thing they call the military civil fusion strategy allows them to have far more influence and direction across specifically their space companies and the ones that they take an interest in, and that would also be high tech, high computing, cyber, which is intimately linked with space. I try to remind everyone that other than actually launching a piece of metal from the Earth into space, everything else that goes on is done through computers and done through cyber networks. And so space and cyber are intimately linked, and you can't divorce the two. And through military civil fusion and through the party apparatus, China has a much more direct hand in that. Now, that also means that when they make big bets, they can bet wrong, right? So there's a lot of good, the flexibility and the ability to have in a free market, to have in private companies that really are private, that may in fact diverge with the leading industries as well as the government or the military, right? And so that's one of the strengths that the Western democracies and our companies bring to it. But we need to be clear-eyed when we look at the great game and the people we're competing with, and keep all of that in mind as we go forward. So I'll leave it here and look forward to the questions at the end. Thanks.
Thanks, Brendan. Christian Zur here with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I thought I'd begin with a quick sum up of the space economy and then make a few key observations drawn from the report, which we can explore later. To set the table, arguably, the space economy today offers a mature set of market products almost exclusively in the area of telecommunications, positional awareness, and high-resolution imagery. We all somewhat understand that, but broadly speaking, those market needs pre-existing the availability of space-enabled data. So for example, since the time of Magellan, sailors sought navigational precision. With the exception today of the highest and lowest latitudes, that data is easily acquirable. So I would suggest that the current space economy largely augments pre-existing business operations and consumer demands. Of course, that can be seen as a good thing. The use of space-enabled data facilitates the development of a range of applications that would not be possible without satellite technology, thus increasing productivity and more efficient use of economic infrastructure and resources. Consider remote imagery to improve crop yields and water conservation, or pharmacology investigations aboard the ISS. All that said, in contrast, the space economy of the future will be qualitatively different and producing outputs distinct from terrestrial use. The major leap of future growth of the sector will be off-Earth economic activities to include R&D and manufacturing, energy exploration and mining, and agricultural outputs. In the near term, fueling the expansion of the space economy are two main factors, which we all quite understand quite well: decreasing costs of upmass and increasing demand of satellite data. Economic activity in this regard is obviously linked to consumer demand for reliable, high-speed, and extreme low latency data, as exemplified by autonomous vehicles. But we have to consider, in addition to autonomous applications, evolving markets for deployment of 5G and IoT will require additional access to orbital data. 5G will be heralding in ubiquity of autonomy far beyond automobiles. Urban mobility will include autonomous aerial vehicles to ferry passengers and cargo. Globally, autonomous aerial and maritime traffic will demand zero latency communications derived from orbital inclinations, thus spurring even greater deployment of satellites. All this will come at a cost. To provide context to this growth, consider there are nearly 3,000 operational satellites currently orbiting Earth. However, in 2018 alone, the FCC approved operating authority for an additional 13,000. And that is just the beginning. The need for a more robust approach to space sustainability is clear. Today, once operational, the day-to-day functioning of spacecraft on orbit or beyond remains effectively outside the regulatory grasp of any governmental authority. So, like climate change, the consequence of orbital clutter was predicted. Arthur C. Clarke wrote of it in the 1960s, the peril of such debris. But of course, it's Don Kessler whose mathematical models became the basis for the moniker, the Kessler syndrome. In essence, that chain effect of orbital conjunction spawn additional structural hazards. And that repeating cycle becomes a problem in LEO, not only for communication satellites, but of course, the ISS where it resides. Case in point, in 1964, NASA launched so-called Object Number 4. Adrift since then, it still circles the planet. So, in parlance of international football, we are chasing the game. If we fail to decisively mitigate these threats, the space economy of tomorrow will be vastly different than current projections. But as Joe Strummer said, the future is unwritten. That is both a challenge and an opportunity. And with that, I will yield the virtual floor.
Thank you so much. I'm Carissa Christensen. I'm the CEO of Bryce Space and Technology. Bryce is an analytic firm, and one of the areas in which we work is space. We publish quite a lot of data on the space economy and trends in the space industry, in part to help inform discussions just like this, to provide evidence and analysis that gives people the data they need to make decisions about what to do from a policy standpoint, from a business standpoint, from a strategy standpoint. And so I thought I would share today a few of the a few slides that might be of interest to expand on the discussion we've had today. So one is, and these are a number of views, a number of ways of looking at the space economy and the space ecosystem. So one way is a quick snapshot. And those of you, probably many of you who've heard me brief this before, I always start out by saying this is not a perfect value chain analysis. This is a blended view of the space economy. It includes commercial actors, it includes government players, it includes key enabling infrastructure, launch and satellite manufacturing. And the intent of this is to give you an instant understanding of the major elements and moving parts of the space economy. So you can see that in purple and blue, the economy is dominated by commercial activity. You can see that the underlying critical enabling infrastructure of satellite manufacturing and launch is a relatively small part, a relatively small proportion. By comparison, you can see that government is has a significant role, but not a dominant role in terms of budgetary government budgets. And there are so many layers, ways in which we could expand this. We could look at the imputed value of communication systems created by government expenditure, where the service value is not reflected here in dollars. We could look at a growing downstream array of applications from GNS chipsets, which are reflected here. So if any view of the space economy is one view answering one set of questions. I like this view because, as I said, particularly for policymakers or business leaders that are coming anew to understanding the space economy, this is a very quick overview. Now, another set of views, and these are all reports that are on our website. The vast majority of data I'm showing you is in brycetech.com. They're not behind a paywall. We're happy for you to use the data. But I combined a few slides to make a couple different points. So we heard about the overall satellite space economy being relatively flat. This is satellite industry revenues. They map pretty closely to the US numbers produced by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And by the way, kudos to that team and kudos to Kevin for taking on a very challenging analytic problem and delivering value to every decision maker in the US that deals with space. So you see that relative flatness driven, as we heard before, by big, mature telecom markets that are under pressure or growing slowly. On the other hand, you might want to look at underlying productivity gains. So the cost of manufacturing satellites for communications purposes, the cost per unit of throughput has dropped 8% in the last, I think, 6 years. Launch costs have dropped about a third in that roughly that same time period. So while revenue may be flat, if you're delivering significantly more value or achieving dominant market share, which the US has in commercial launch, for example, over the last decade, that's a very different and important part of the story of what is going on in the space economy and the space ecosystem. Another metric that is really a great indicator of the importance of drilling down is number of satellites, and this is only through 2019. That number has gone up even more dramatically in 2020 by about almost another 1,000. So that is indicative of a transformative change. If we looked at that differently and we looked at total up mass, meaning how big those satellites were, the total up mass has not gone up in anywhere near as much because we're launching lots and lots of small satellites. Another great indicator of change in the space economy is venture investment in space. And in the lower right-hand corner, you can see a chart, particularly in the last 5 years, there's been a spike in venture and super angel investment in innovative space companies. And so that also is an indicator that is telling a very different story than the overall relatively flat top line. Every single one of these pieces of information that I'm showing you, every single one of these views is exactly accurate for what it is. And so in order to understand the ecosystem, in order to understand the trends, the point that I would make is that it is always important to look at a layered data set and to understand the question that you're asking and the answer that you're getting. Oh, sorry about that. There's also Kevin O'Connell mentioned, I think this is a really nice viewpoint, and Mike French made the point that while space may not be the only way to achieve a market goal, space may enable, may enhance, may augment capabilities. So from that point of view, satellites and satellite activity are key to, they're relevant to $5 trillion across the US economy and twice that or more globally. So that's another important consideration when you're looking at financial, economic, and national security impacts of space. Finally, per Christian's excellent points about the current digital space economy and the future potentially evolving new space economy serving new markets and applications. This is a quick look at emerging LEO markets such as space tourism, such as on-orbit manufacturing, such as even marketing and terrestrial mining. And the key point I would make here is that there is a very dynamic mix of government and commercial driven demand and a time horizon and a risk horizon that varies market by market. Finally, I wanted to, since our overall topic is China, and I very much appreciated the remarks about China from our colleague, very informative. China, this is a lot of data on a small slide, so I recommend the report to you that's on the website. China has a robust and highly structured space, a group of space organizations driving to meet national goals and objectives. China has seen consistently growing numbers of orbital launches. And in recent years, that number has increased significantly. And looking at venture investment in space, after investors in the US, investors in China surpassed all other countries in terms of the number of companies receiving financing, the amount of money invested, the number of deals made, and participating investors. So investment in China, venture investment in China, recognizing that there are some structural differences in definitions about what is commercial financial investment in the context of China, is a very, very active part of the Chinese space ecosystem. And so with that, I am going to finish my remarks and very much look forward to a conversation, because I've seen some extremely interesting audience questions show up on the chat already. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and Casey, thank you and the team for putting together this event.
Oh my gosh, thank you, panel members. Those were some really great points, and I love the Bryce reports, Carissa, and thank you for the remarks with respect to China. That was very informative. I want to introduce you all to Scott Maitner, who is our strategy and operations lead for NewSpace New Mexico, and he's going to lead our Q&A. And just want to let you all know again, I know there's some questions in the Q&A, but if you have questions for the panel members and Kevin O'Connell, or even Bruce, Cahan, and Mir Sadat, please go for that. And I'll turn it over to Scott to lead the Q&A.
Thanks, Casey. I would also like to thank the panelists for their comments. And I just want to give you a shout out for being so professional. We are absolutely right on time. This is brilliant after an hour and 5 minutes. I'd like to thank our audience. We've got about 160 to 170 participants. They've stayed engaged. They've asked some questions. And I'm going to go and read those questions to the panel. And I'd also like to invite Bruce or Mir to chime in as they'd like to as well. I think what I'd like to do first, unless there's any objections, there were a couple of questions that were answered early on that were privately answered. And I just wanted to read those and offer up, Kevin, if you wanted to repeat your answer, and other panelists as well. So the first one is, do you expect the incoming administration that they will consider the national space policy and the new era for deep space exploration and development? Will they consider those things big tent and bipartisan enough to be continued?
So thanks, Scott, very much. As I said to the person who asked the question, you know, we have enjoyed seeing space as a bipartisan matter. Pursuit of exploration, pursuit of space commerce, the role of commercial, some of the things that I touched upon. And I think both of those documents and many others are certainly great foundations going forward. So I would hope to see continuity in that, not any dramatic change. There may be change at the margins, points of emphasis, things like that. But I think those documents will serve foundationally for the next administration and many to come. Remember, it was a decade between the last national space policy and this one. And there's a lot of continuity even between the two, as it turns out. So we hope this one will be of use in the same way to future administrations.
Excellent. Are any other panelists would like to amplify that one, or should we move on to the next one? Just if you'd like to talk, just go ahead and unmute and thank you, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to echo what Kevin has said, it does seem like the Biden administration plans to continue with the lunar efforts. And as you know, in the past, we've had this Mars moon, and I was heartened to see that seems to be their goals.
Yeah, I would just like to underscore that. I think very much to the credit of the senior leadership within this outgoing administration, including Kevin, that linear progression has been certainly welcomed by industry, from policy outlets and nonprofits. I think it was transparent and linear, and I think by all accounts the incoming administration will use that going forward, because why not? I really think, again, it speaks to the individuals that led those various efforts to keep it on a very bipartisan, open process, and thus those outcomes that we're now seeing, I think, will be built upon. So, you know, that's at least the U.S. Chamber of Commerce view.
All right, well, I'll move on to the next question. If anyone else wants to answer, just jump in now. This is an interesting one. All of our questions are great. This one is particularly interesting. So one of the most important issues for space commerce will be ownership. Is there any effort going on from the US government side to build a consensus across the world, maybe through the UN, to make sure that we have the right ownership rights?
So again, I responded to that question by starting and saying that there's been a growing number of countries that are pursuing private property rights in space. Those ideas were pioneered by the United States and Luxembourg, and we're seeing a growing number of countries interested in that. And I don't see that trend abating, actually. I know Chris probably has something to say on this.
Not only is there national space legislation, but also this is cooked into the Artemis Accords.
Yeah, exactly.
And what is in the Artemis Accords is not a comprehensive, conception of property rights, but merely a reflection that property rights are permissible and that they're a part of our Artemis activities. So again, this is not, when we talk about modest, correctly balanced rules, this is merely saying that, in order to, that it's in your best interest, other states, it's in states' best interest to have a shared understanding of that use of property rights in space, is permissible. And there doesn't need to be a deep understanding or a totally homogeneous understanding of those property rights, but merely that it is a freedom or a right that they are allowed to go and undertake those things. So actually, this is a great way to have international discussions and consensus, not talk about prohibitions, but talk about shared understandings of rights and freedoms.
If I could add to that, dovetailing on what I said earlier about the linear progression, I think the Artemis Accords, the very measured approach that Mike Gold and his team have made, I think are very important to build that consensus. Chris, as you pointed out, not to be prohibitive, but to be fairly inclusive in the process. If we've learned one thing, we don't do it alone. We have to try to build these de facto organizational, whether it be industry best practices or governmental, I lightly use the term regulations, but this idea that it will be applied to a much broader group than simply companies licensed in the United States. So when it comes to off-Earth property, intellectual property, physical property, those are going to be real areas of contention. So once again, I applaud the outgoing administration and NASA in particular for the very measured approach of the elements of the Artemis Accord, and look forward to building on that in the next administration.
All right, great answers. Thank you very much. Next question is another great one. The report discusses the low rate of DoD space experimentation and prototype development. Can the panelists please give us their insight on that issue, whether or not they see the maturation of the Space Force as potentially having a positive influence, and any effects that low rates of DoD experimentation has on the commercial space industry?
This is Mike. I'll jump in here on the Space Force side. From our perspective, the Space Force is an excellent opportunity, for both acquisition but also people. Right? It's a unique opportunity to say, we've been talking about things that can be done differently in both how we buy things and how we think about requirements, as well as the type of people we need today and looking at the future to do these capabilities. And so we're, as an association, we're actually, very actively working here, with Air Force, Space Force, the DoD procurement enterprise, and the Congress to do just that. So, sort of in short, do see the Space Force an opportunity to try some best practices the community's been thinking about for a while.
Any other panelists who'd like to chime in on that question about space experimentation and prototyping?
I'd just say quickly on that, the experimentation is actually going on. It's a matter of paying attention to what is going on in the market, anticipating what's going on in the market. And that's why these, I talked about the people that knock on this door here and at DIU. It's important that we look at those, very dynamically. Now, again, to a point Christian made, we're going to move from a world in which, we know how to do launch. We know how to do remote sensing. We know how to do GPS and navigation. We're going to move into a world where no one in the government has familiarity with some of these things. And so both from a user perspective and a regulation perspective, you're going to have to think very, very hard about that. You're going to have to take some risks, and that's very important. but anticipating what's coming in the market. Thank you, world that all of us, I think, here remember, in which people would say, "You're going to do what?" You know, sometimes people will say, "You're going to do what?" You know, no, that can't be done. Okay, we thankfully have abandoned that mindset for most things that at least we've heard about here at Commerce.
What level of US-China government to government and company to company collaboration should be undertaken, if any? And just as a reminder, I would like to remind our report authors, Bruce Cahan and Mir Sadat, that they are welcome to chime in as well.
I'll start on that just to get it underway. You know, it's merely that we need to have dialogue and discussions and consultations. It doesn't need to be cooperation, programmatic operational cooperation, but you know, shared lines of communication and discussions about what concepts are commonly held, whether that can be government to government or NGO to civil society to academia to scientific community. Seeing what conversations we can have, I think is going to be crucial, at least merely for shared understanding, so that we say, we understand what the Chinese conception of property rights are, or due regard under Article 9. What does it mean to them? Or, you know, what we share our conceptions of what we mean by safety zones as discussed in the Artemis Accords. Modest discussions like that, I think, will be fundamental.
I would agree with that. I'm not going to dictate policy to the U.S. as to what we should do, but I'll tell you, one of the major concerns that we face is that space, at least as it exists today, all of these things are readily transferable between commercial technologies and then national defense security technologies, right? And so anything that is shared with even a commercial company, even for purely scientific reasons, is easily transferred to the PLA. I'm not trying to be alarmist there, but you know, our partners, the Austrians, were the ones that partnered with the Chinese to set up their first quantum communication satellite, right? So a lot of people don't realize that, but it was actually the Austrian government and institutes that helped make that achievable for them. And it was absolutely a scientific breakthrough, but it absolutely is feeding into the PLA and their capabilities in the future. And, you know, with high technology across all high technology, but space specifically, these are really, really hard issues to try to disentangle. And so that makes U.S. leaders very tentative on any kind of cooperation, you know, be it purely commercial, whatever that happens to mean, or purely scientific. And those are the challenges we face. But I absolutely agree with Chris that keeping the lines of communication and understanding, even if we can't establish a common set of rules or a common set of norms, at least understanding what the other side perceives as those rules and norms are is going to be crucial as we go forward.
Great, thank you for those answers. Oh, Kevin, did you want to chime in there?
No, I mean, I would only offer, in response to the two other comments, I'd only offer more of a personal perspective, which is that on the handful of occasions that I've had an exchange with Chinese officials on space, their views of space and things like driving efficiency, productivity, government industry relations are very, very different from ours. And so the shared understanding is kind of the foundation.
And return of space resources to Earth. So the bottom line is, when and how is the U.S. going to address this issue?
Well, I think I've spent every day of the entirety of my time here at the Commerce Department on this particular issue. There is a plan. There is now congressional funding and direction that endorses a mandate to do this in the way we thought about it. And let's return to some of the principles of how to address this. This is a problem that's moving and changing very, very quickly, moving at speed. And so our view has been the commercial world has to play an absolutely key role in developing solutions to that. A couple of weeks ago, we actually wound up being a 2-day industry day with over 250 participants to talk about the kinds of capabilities that can be brought to bear on this. The problem is multidimensional. I think it's Administrator Bridenstine that likes to say there's 4 ways to think about this. One is don't create new debris, improve space situational awareness. That's where the bulk of my time has been spent. That leads to better space traffic coordination, if you will, space traffic management. And then there's the active debris removal. I know you've got a question there from a colleague on the active debris removal. All 4 of those have to be part of the, if you will, the portfolio going forward. And the final thing I'll say about this is that this is a commonly held view in industry as much as it is in governments, that industry recognizes that the path to the growth of space commerce has to go through an improved focus on space safety and sustainability.
All right.
Well, given that, I think we're at the point where I can hand it back over to Casey. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience members, for your great questions. We answered a lot of them, not all of them, but it's time to hand it back to Casey.
So thank you so much. Thank you, panel members. Thank you, Kevin, for your wonderful keynote. I want to let you know that we're going to be putting together a summary of this webinar. So we'll try and address the questions maybe that we didn't get answered. And we'll tell you a little more. We'll post the videos afterwards. But for right now, I want to turn it back to Bruce Cahan and Mir Sadat to summarize, to let us know where our next steps are. And then I'll get on one more time and tell you about our following 4 webinars that we hope you all can join in the next weeks. So over to you, Bruce and Mir, and thank you again to Kevin O'Connell and our wonderful panelists.
Hey, I want to thank everybody for that great discussion. And as you see, there's a tremendous amount of diversity of thought, and that's where we are actually, the United States is very successful in. And so I think that is something we need to continue and leverage, and Casey will explain the subsequent webinars, how we are actually going to delve further into each specific area. But one of the things I think that's important and we need to consider that has been raised was the idea of having international standards, norms, rules, frameworks, and all of that for not only creating peace, but enabling humanity and each nation to actually create wealth for their nation as well as for their economies through whether it's the exploratory ways or just of using space as a pass-through domain. One of the things that we spoke about as well in our report that we can get a chance to really get into here, we'll hopefully get into next time, is talking about and first of all, neither Bruce and I are speaking on behalf of the US government, so I want to get that out of the way, but directing, the DoD or the Space Force to map out the cislunar operating domain so that as they are protecting the emergent space lines of communication and civil exploration, that we know what we're doing and where we're at. And that is not any different than for example, what the Navy does at sea. And as was mentioned, the role that Space Force will play with dual use types of technologies, the continuation of streamlining processes. I mean, a great example of this is the shame that the Army was just able last month to get their first masks for COVID. I mean, talk about broken processes, right? Just to get masks. And then, of course, innovative ways to inspire new business models. And we've been seeing this, as Mike mentioned, in the COVID environment. And of course, further cooperation throughout the US government. And I'm actually a proponent of further cooperation with NASA, with DoD and NASA, That doesn't militarize NASA. It's just more cooperation, and of course NOAA. And Kevin mentioned very eloquently the importance of leveraging economic tools to increase our commercial sector, as well as our reach to our allies, as well as our ventures internationally. I'll leave the financial aspects and the commodities for Bruce, but I think one of the other aspects that is going to be very important is the discussion about STEM, the science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and the need by 2025 or even later in the decade for those fields and training, and both vocational training and education to be fielded by someplace. So if we are complaining that the world's populations are coming to the US to work here, then we better be ready to make investments in our nation and in our population to cultivate Americans and US nationals and US persons to fulfill those roles. If we can't do that, then we must invite the world's talent here to come build our enterprises in the space and other S&T fields. So that's another piece that I think is important. And overall, the economic competition is something that will happen whether we want it or not. We need to prepare for it. And as the panel mentioned, we need to set boundaries and different types of decorum so that we don't collide. And nobody wants collision, especially in space. With that, I turn it over to Bruce.
Thanks to the panel, thanks to Scott, and certainly to Mir. We will distribute after each of the webinars a more robust summary, but I did want to hit a couple of points. First of all, from Kevin and everybody else on the panel, we are seeing a shift in the space economy, and it does need, and it is developing a series of norms and customs that will permit financing and investment. Some that is led from industry, some from government. In my own work on the Space Commodities Exchange, obviously a rule book reflecting how a board of trade for the exchange would operate means that everybody internationally who can be observing the rules of that rule book can trade. That would be a great development. Second, we've heard a lot about the power, but also the molasses of the federal procurement system. And we need to solve that, because that's not China dictating our procurement system, that's us. In terms of the private sector, I think having the predictability of demand, and Carissa talked about this a little, that you're building infrastructure or assets in space. You're going to investors, you're going to the market or lenders to produce these assets. You need to see a predictability of demand. The government in all the history of terrestrial pioneering creates some of that demand, but it's good to see the BEA and others estimate what the downstream demand for space assets and infrastructure will be. And I want to just hit on another aspect of the STEM discussion that Mir raises. Not only do we need to recruit and curate and encourage our own citizens to go into STEM and the allied fields of finance and engineering, but we also need to pay attention, I think, to the Black, Hispanic, Indigenous, physically challenged, all the diversity that is our country. Really gives the different perspectives. One of the panelists mentioned that we don't just march to one drummer in this country, for good and bad. And that diversity is where the innovations that show up at Commerce or show up at DIU will come from, is in response to the diversity of experience. So making sure that we have that in our education system, our public education system primarily, and that is lifelong learning for mid-career people to have an opportunity to go into the space economy, I think is really, really important. And finally, as is mentioned, we want allies in space. You can't solve any of the debris or other issues in space without allies, but we have to show that you do make more money with allies than you do by opposing the norms and going it your own way. There's every reason for space to show the Earth how we can cooperate. It won't be easy because it's not our style. But if we look at 2060, we have to do it. So with that, I'll turn it back to Casey to wrap up because I think we're at time. And just thank you all, and I hope you'll join us for the other webinars coming up.
Thank you all. I just want to end quickly, just to let you know about the future webinars. You could always go to newspacenm.org. And like I said, we will have information there also on this webinar and recordings. And as we close, I'll share my screen, and it does have what our next webinars are. But thank you so much for joining, and hopefully we'll see you next week. These are the next Thursdays for the next 4 weeks. We will see you here and hope you can make it. Thank you again, and thank you to our speakers and our authors. Great job.
Thanks, Casey.
Thank you.